Hi, in this episode I'll be talking to Gareth Lock, an award-winning expert on applying human factors and non-technical skills to diving. Over a brew, Gareth talks about how his military aviation and research background has led to his unique training programs which focus on counter-errorism. Do you fancy a brew? Hello.
Hello Andy, how are you?
I'm good. I only had one ear working then, that's strange. It's been one long day with that heat, I think.
Oh yeah, I know what you mean. I'm feeling just in that sort of I can't really give a fuck moment mood. I normally end up doing sort of work in the evenings, but I'm just like, nah, not interested. So
I've not even finished brewing my brew because my dinner was so late. So and
I drank the gin and tonic that I was going to drink while I was
mate.
here.
Well, a friend of mine I've not seen. We dived at Cape and Ray yesterday when it first opened. First one in the water. Get in.
Excellent.
We met. Do you know?
The viz was okay until that point.
It was all right, but it wasn't. It certainly, you know how it's been advertised with people flying drones over it recently. It wasn't that at all, which is a shame. But it was okay. I'd not seen her since lockdown had happened. It was my 40th, the end of March, which we were supposed to be having a bit of a get together for. And she turned up last night with this, yesterday afternoon at Cape and Ray with this big bottle of gin. So we got on it last night.
I saw the picture. Yeah. But that's what prompted me to make a gin and tonic earlier.
Well,
so it's like, I fancy one of those.
I said to Ali when when she'd finished making dinner, I said, "What are we drinking? Are we having just a glass of water or a glass of juice, or should we get on the gin?" And she went, "Oh, I can't have another gin this week because we're trying not to drink midweek because it's been horrific for doing that, hasn't it? Which is quite fun, but nonetheless." So
I know what you mean. Yeah, I know.
So I've got a brew and you're on water.
I am on a pint of water. There we go. Pushing a boat out.
Legend. Right. So welcome, Gareth Lock, to Fancy a Brew podcast. If you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of an introduction to who you are, and how people might find you and whatnot, and then we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, sure. So Gareth Lock. I'm a diver who's based in Malmesbury in Wiltshire. I've lived in this area since about 1991, where I finished my navigator training based in Finningley in the Royal Air Force and started my career flying on Hercules transport aircraft based down here. And that's, I was 18 when I joined the Air Force, so straight from high school into the Air Force. That was a big, wide-eyed opened situation. And over the following 25 26 years that I was in, got exposed to lots of different jobs, roles, as air crew, as a navigator, as an instructor, as a flight commander on a squadron looking after. The easy way to describe air crew is grown-up children, so having 125 grown-up children to look after. And that was sort of where my exposure to a lot of this concept called crew resource management or non-technical skills. And I left the frontline flying in 2004 to go and do a master's in aerospace systems, which was a crash course in anything to do with aviation and aerospace. 2-3 week module, learn, dump, pass the exam and move on. And then got involved in trials work and systems work, systems engineering, and then research and development, and then procurement and requirements management. Now, while I was going through the master's course, we did a trip down to South Africa, which was 2 weeks long. And I certified as a PADI open water about 5 years beforehand, but I hadn't dived between then, just because of stuff that was going on, family life and things. And the guy said, "Well, look, we've got an opportunity to go diving. If we've got certification cards, bring them along." So we went to a place called Gansby, which is about 45 minutes east of Cape Town, and got in the water. There was no sort of checking of cards. There was no check dive. I was like, "Oh, this is great." I've always loved being in the water as a kid. And it's like, "Oh, this would be great." And then a month later, we were out in San Diego again with a course, visiting industry out on the West Coast.
So you're not military at this point now?
Yeah, I'm still military. So it was part of the master's course. So the idea was then to become an intelligent customer as such. So So yeah, going out to the States, middle weekend, we're in San Diego, and it's like, I want to get diving again. So the Saturday, I found a dive operator, and I went with a guide, and limited to 18 meters. It was great. 3 dives, sea lions, and seeing the in the swell and the surf, and it's like, yes, this is what I want to get back into. The following day, I went diving with a buddy, and bearing in mind this is now dive probably 9 that I'm doing. There were no open water dives available. So I managed to get onto an advanced open water dive that was onto a place called the Yukon and Wreck Alley. Still as an open water diver, signed some extra waiver forms, take the risk. Yeah, I know what I'm doing. It's fine. And, full rental gear. But I had bought myself a dive computer because that's important. So, it's shiny, get that. So jump off the back of the boat, and my fin pops off, and it's like, oh, okay, struggle to get that back on. Swim around to the anchor chain and start going down the line. And I can't put any gas into my BCD. They're pressing the inflator button, and I'm going down. It's a wetsuit, so there's no additional buoyancy. No. But I do know that the bottom is 30 meters or so, 100 feet, 30 meters. And it's like, okay, I'm aware that I'm not going to barrel down to this massive depth. So I hit the bottom in a cloud of sand, and signal to my buddy that I can't get this to work. What's going on? And eventually we work out that the low pressure inflator, where it attaches to the nipple on the inflator hose, had popped off a little bit. So it looked like it was working, but there was no gas going in. So we swam around, and we sort of did another 30-meter dive later. And it was like, I want to do more diving. And so I got back into the UK, joined Yorkshire Divers as the forum that was available at that time, and fell in with the wrong crowd, I would say, with the sort of DIR GUE UK group at that stage. So that would have been 2005. So I did fundamentals in 2006, Tech 1, which is normoxic trimix, in 2007, and then advanced trimix in 2008. And I was diving pretty much every weekend I could at that stage. So lots of dives, fantastic opportunities. Had kids at that stage, but was separated. So I was doing what I could for my own time outside. And just had a fantastic time getting involved in diving projects. And I started to get involved in underwater photography as well, because I'd done a lot of topside work, and I thought, oh, okay, let's go and do some underwater photography. So bought myself a digital SLR, some strobes, and started doing sort of deeper, cold water, green water wreck diving, and loved it. It was great fun. So I've got a huge library from the stuff that's, thinking back now, sort of 10, 12 years ago now, doing remote strobe work, which at that time very few people were doing, and just doing sort of good quality wreck photography and people in those. So no, it was great at that stage.
I suppose it's good to be able to get the chance to get on a wreck and do photography stuff like that without a bunch of other divers being in the way. Like certainly for me yesterday, it was paramount. I was going to try and make a video yesterday, but so I had to be the first one in Cape and Ray. So we left our house at 7. We were there at 20 to 8. But before I'd got to the position where I wanted to be in, there was people coming past me already, and it's hard, isn't it? Especially when they don't have that stable platform or that intuition of, oh, we might be taking some photographs here. I'll try not to kick everything up as I walk past, as I swim past, which can be a nightmare. So, if you don't mind, I want to pick your brains about GUE. I'm very much and have been since day one, not pushed, but inspired to go down the DIR route, but as yet not gone GUE. I don't really, I know one or two, but not well enough, to go and pick their brains. And while you're on and you're talking about it, let's pick your brains. So fundamentals sounds like an absolute mission. Now that might just be me thinking this is going to be nails because of what they do and how good they are. But it's a training camp as such, isn't it?
It is.
It's not come here and show us how great you are day one.
It's a massive mindset shift, and this bit that says, people, you're going to invest some money and time. and people want to get the tech pass, the highest level pass that comes out of it, because that's what they've invested in. And to a certain extent, some people come in and go, right, I've got the card, I've got a tech pass, look at me, I did fundamentals, awesome, and they wear it as the badge of honor. And that's when they sort of come into the class, and then by the time they leave the class, they go, wow, okay, this is not a pure skill-based thing. This is an attitude thing that says, how do I get better? And every GUE instructor that's out there, it's about developing people and learning. And if they don't finish the class, if they don't get a tech pass on the class, well, they're normally available to go and do the coaching and then do a reassessment within the next 6 months. So I think one of these bits of going in there with the attitude that says, I have to get a tech pass. And that sometimes sets yourself up for failure because you're working so hard to get up there when actually it should be about learning. And, my journey there, I in 2006, I did my fundies. 2 weeks before that, I did my advanced nitrox and deco with Mark Powell, who I know has been on beforehand. And I wish I'd done it the other way around, but it was, there was a lot of faff in the water in terms of buoyancy control and things. And the goal of that year was to be able to go and dive the Scapa Rex in the August of 2006.
Right.
So it was about, I knew when I finished the class with Mark that I wasn't, not that I wasn't confident. I was in a training mode. I was in a learning mode that says, I've now finished the class with Mark. I now know that I've got to grow and practice and consolidate that. And the fundies was that next step forward. And I did fundies because I wanted a stable platform, because I was doing photography. And I just wanted, this sort of, I wanted to be good. And I wanted to have that target to hit. And I think that's part of my internal drive as well. All the way through my Air Force career. Even just last weekend, I did a 100-kilometer bike ride that I wanted to do for charity. And it's like, with a month to go, who's done one of these? Oh, nobody. Yeah, let's do it. And I was going to do 50 miles. Yeah, exactly. Did 50 miles the weekend before, so it was 80 Ks. And went, you know what? I can do another 20 Ks next weekend. So I did it. So it's this about, having a challenge. So I did fundamentals so I could have that baseline. I then did Tech 1, the sort of normoxic trimix, so I could do fundamentals underwater photography without thinking about the diving. It was about getting to the stage where it became automatic, being able to hold a stop plus or minus 50 centimeters without silting up the situation. With that year, so in 2008, we went to Narvik and we were diving a number of the wrecks up there. And there's lots of iron ore silt inside the wrecks. So the ability to swim literally inches off the bottom and shoot up into the diver who's coming towards you, which is the great shot to have, as opposed to shooting down on them, and have the visibility preserved was key. And then I did Tech 2, so I could do normoxic level diving, underwater photography, without thinking about that. So, in terms of fundamentals, I think it's a big eye-opener for people, because a lot of people go into the class and go, yeah, I know this. And, you'll get normoxic trimix instructors or hypoxic trimix instructors coming in and go, yeah, I can do this. And they go, ooh, actually, and that's just at the fundamentals level. I want you to stay stable in the water and put an SMB up and monitor the two divers that are in your team at the same time. And it's like, how hard can that be? Well,
it depends if you've not dived in the last few weeks or not, isn't it?
Well,
how regular you become as how regular you go diving, that'll impact that. I've not dived for 3 months now. I was reasonably stable yesterday, but I couldn't do what you just talked about then. No chance.
And I think it's that bit like getting on a bike, that once you've got that baseline and you know what good looks like, and more importantly, what good feels like, then actually it's quite quick to jump back on there. I think that's one of the hardest bits for instructors to teach, is what good trim feels like. because on the surface, gravity is giving you the muscular feedback. It's influencing what your body is doing without even realizing it. And so where your limbs are. Your brain is working that out without knowing. When you get underwater, now gravity is acting in a different way. And so you don't get that same mental feedback as to where your limbs are. So, you can do dry drills on the surface, on the benches where you see people sitting there with their feet up and their arms out. You're like, what are you doing? Yes, you can get people into that mindset, but then get them underwater and understand what you're going to have to do to tweak people and teach that self-awareness is really quite a skill. I think the hardest, when in my human factors training, drawing a parallel to that, the hardest thing is to teach other people situation awareness, because it is generated internally by the other person, and it is influenced by their experiences, by their training, what they've done, what they're sensing right now. And I would find it very difficult to teach somebody, or I do find it very difficult to teach somebody what they are being aware of. I can give them cues and pointers.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing with trim, is you have to have a quite a deep level of knowledge to understand how to tweak somebody's body to get there, why it's not working.
I did a course with a guy called Gary Dallas a few years ago. It was my side mount course. So he uses a camera, for showing that. Now, he was my initial inspiration for getting that really stable platform, because there's a video he's got on YouTube of him popping DSM and it's literally like he's just like someone's suspending him, or he's lying on a sheet of glass in that water so you can't. And I was like, I need to be that good, because going through my BSAC sport diver, I'd seen people hanging off them or holding on to shot lines and stuff. And I was looking at this guy going, why can he do it like that? And everyone who seems to be influencing me can't. So when I eventually got the opportunity to go on a course with him, and he videoed me, he's the only one so far of my instructors that I've been with that showed me throughout that particular dive where I was, whether I was up, head down, where the gas was bleeding from, whether it was from my neck seal or my arm. And it was that sort of that mind's eye picture of where I wanted to be and then where I actually was. So I was more aware and could correct that. So I think without that image in your brain, if you can't project that, then you're almost on a loser.
Well, it is that bit, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what is achievable. So one of the expeditions I did when I was at Boscombe Down, which would have been 2006, somewhere around there, 6, 7. We went out to Dahab, and we took a bunch of ocean divers, sports divers. I was doing my dive leader at that stage, so went through that quite quickly. And I was sitting there in a sort of a long hose rig, a bladder, backplate and wing, and I was sitting there in the water flat, and they're going, "How are you doing that?" And it was just, what was brilliant was they would then start to influence, that was having an influence on them. They go, "How do we do that? How do we?" And it's like, okay, so set yourself up, put your head back, do this sort of arches, bring your feet in so that you're not going to be tilted back. And then people started using the rear dump on their own BCDs. You go, oh, actually, I can do this.
Yeah.
And then getting to the stage of getting people to, instead of kneeling on the bottom to put an SMB up, just come off the bottom, hold neutral. You might not be flat, but just be neutrally buoyant. And then you can start, build. And it was just that sort of, I'm going to say role modeling, but when you see people copy that and you go, I want to do that. How are you staying still? Why are you not moving anywhere? You're taking a big camera with me, doing all these shots. And they're like, I want to do that. And you think, that's what it's about. And I think, where you see that inspiration, and then there's this mindset that says, it is possible and I want to do it. Now, it doesn't apply to everybody, because people are like, a lot of people are just like, whatever, quite happy to bimble around, because they don't necessarily want to put the amount of effort that's required to get in there. Once you've applied that effort, though, it's like momentum.
Yeah.
Once you get going, it becomes much easier. But yeah, the first sort of few days, and normally it's sort of, yeah, I'm not doing very well. Yeah, I've got some skills. Oh, I'm not doing very well at all. Hey, and I've got it. So there is a bit of a roller coaster ride of emotions.
With that in mind, would you suggest then that a lot of instructors seem to be going to more of this neutral buoyancy from day one? Would you think that knees down or learning the fin pivot is kind of old now, and we need to be moving instructors past that? Or is there still a place for that somewhere, do you think?
No. So, GUE teaches a recreational 1 level class, which is in effect open water, advanced open water, and a bit of rescue diver. And that starts you start flat. And I know that, I think last year it was, Paddy had updated their training materials and said that, drills should be taught neutrally buoyant. And so getting people into that mindset that says this is what normal looks like, because there is this, law of primacy. If you've been taught to kneel on the bottom, overweighted to do your drills, well, when you come to the real world, you don't know any better. And so you will revert to being upright because that's what I'm comfortable doing things. Now that introduces a whole bunch of other issues. Now, when instructors say, oh, well, you can't teach a flat trim, neutrally buoyant class, you go, you can. It requires the instructors to up their game as well. Yeah. And that's uncomfortable for people because they've invested a whole bunch of time. And so on, nobody's told me that I'm doing it wrong. So therefore I must be doing it right. Yeah. And it is a mindset shift. So it is slowly coming in from the agencies, and it's great. And, as an underwater photographer, and you sort of touched on it earlier, the benefit of getting onto a wreck that people haven't kicked the proverbial out, the visibility. Yeah. And you just sit, and it's like, well, I saw what I was doing. It's like, yeah, cheers, thanks. And if the tide's not running, if the current's not running, the silt will just stay there. So, the quarries, I've not dived in Cap and Ray, but Bobster, when the silt gets kicked up, and the same thing in Chepstow, which are my two sort of training sites, when the viz gets kicked up, it just stays there.
Horrendous,
isn't it? Yeah. There needs to be a feedback system within the training organizations. And I know they have forms that they tick off and say, have you done these skills? But there are very few agencies that go and do an active reassessment of their instructors every 3 or 4 years, which is what GUE and RAID do. Yeah. You've got an instructor examiner who will come onto your class and they will assess you teaching a class. And that's what needs to happen.
I mean, where I can put some validity to that is, so I did mine in 2017, let's say, and I haven't done a lot of teaching. I'll quite happily put my hand up and say I didn't want to be an instructor for anything else than getting onto joint services expeditions around the world. I have no interest. I just want to go diving. Obviously, I've developed a little bit with what I do on YouTube and doing this, and obviously it gives me a foundation as such, a platform to start from. But because I haven't done much teaching, I was asked to fill in for someone and go and do a full day of dive leader lectures at a local fire station where they used a big conference room they've got there. And I had to revise so much and then go, which is only right, and all that. You should do it anyway. But I went through the lectures with my wife, who's a diver, so that helps, and prepped for that. So when I got there, I really didn't even need the slideshow. I was that ready for it. But if I hadn't have done that, I could have turned up, taught them anything, and no one would be any the wiser until one of them does something wrong or says, oh, Andy told me this. Yeah. And then they work out it's wrong. But there's plenty of heated debates out there whether you should be on your knees to start with or a fin pivot. And I get it, to get them up on to that platform. But maybe the
so actually you can start, I know that one of my colleagues, an instructor in the States, they just start on the surface and with a mask, and that's it. So, and they have a reg that's in a BCD floating on the surface. And so they're getting used to buoyancy control with their body flat. Right. And that, I think, is through UTD. And so they get used to just being there. GUE will start on the bottom flat in the pool, and getting people used to that, so they don't know any better or they don't know any different. So you know what to do as opposed to what not to do.
So almost your default setting is straight back flat, isn't it? It's not anything but that.
Yeah.
Because you've never done anything before that. Yeah, it's cracking.
Yeah, exactly. So, and the thing is that then people go, but there are times when you don't need to be flat. And you go, yeah, I know. So what you do is, that's your baseline. And now you can move yourself so that, if you're going up through a wreck, well, you don't, there might not be the space to elevate up through it. Yeah. You've got to go up. But then you've got to realize that you're not going to be finning, because if you fin, you're going to kick the silt out for the next person, So it's understanding, it's almost this bit of appropriate trim rather than flat trim all the time.
Yeah.
The default is flat, but it should also be appropriate.
We could do this topic to death and not talk about anything else. We'll come back on next week and we'll chat more. Episode 2 about trim and buoyancy again.
There's just so much of that.
I came across you, it was largely to do with your book being advertised on Facebook a lot last year. Mm-hmm. And I've got a really good friend of mine, I mention all the time, but don't actually mention who he is on here because I don't want to embarrass him or whatever. But he's done me a lot of favours, so in return, I thought I'll buy him your book. He'd be quite interested in that. He's.
You hadn't bought it at this stage for yourself, though.
No, I bought it for him. That's why I've got it. So I asked his wife, and I says, just check that he hasn't got this particular book. Yeah. I'll look round now. He's not there. So I turned up that night with it for him, and he says, Did you ask my wife? I said, yeah. He said, it's on my my nightstand. I've been reading it for the last 3 weeks. How has she not seen that? I've been talking to her about it and all sorts. So hence, I now have a copy from my children for me for Christmas that I bought myself.
Excellent.
It was on my Christmas list anyway, but much like Mark Powell's second book, I hadn't got to read it. So when me and you started chatting last week about it, we went to my in-laws last weekend for a bit just to see them, and when they went out on the beach walking the dogs, I was like trying to motor through this book. I'm not going to lie, it was the hardest book I've ever read in my entire life. I'm not a particularly well-educated young man from Wigan, I'm afraid. However, I did learn a little bit, and I particularly enjoyed and found easier the case studies, and then could apply. If I read them, I could sort of pick holes in where the topic was going, which is obviously why you've put them in.
That was the idea. That was awesome. There we go.
Funnily enough, yeah.
Imagine that.
How, knowing the general theme of your book being around accidents and incidents and how we can perhaps improve our thinking around them, but we don't talk enough about them to do it adequately enough in greater circles. How easy was it for you to get people that were quite well known to write articles in there for you?
Surprisingly easy, actually. And I think part of that was because by the time, it took me about 6 months to write, and I would say that was probably from April to October 18, March, April 18 through to about October time. And what I did in the March or so is I wrote to about 60 people, 55, 60 people, somewhere around that sort of number. And I said, in confidence, I'm writing a book. Are you interested in contributing? I'm looking for a story of about 1,000 words, 850 to 1,250 words, about something that's happened, good or bad, indifferent. But I want it to be a context-rich story. And I want you to talk about the errors you made, the rules you broke, the deviations that you took, the pressures that you were under. And ultimately, that simple question, how did it make sense? And so out of that 55, 60, I got about 40 back. So it was like, oh, that's cool. I can work with those. Some of them didn't quite. Yeah, it was. I was really pleased with the percentage that came back, because I think prior to that, so I started the Human Diver in 2016, and I started doing formal research in this area in 2012 when I started a self-funded part-time PhD at Cranfield.
Well, you've jumped the gun. I was going to ask you, how's your PhD going? Because that was one of the first things you said on the interview that I heard. I have re-listened to it today purposely. I was like, so, how's your PhD going? Oh, well, time, kids, money.
So I'll come on to that one in a minute. I've done red here, so there's an issue here. So, collecting the stories, going back to people, and actually most of those stories only needed a little bit of tweaking. Yeah. Most of them are pretty much verbatim as they were submitted to me. And then I added the analysis on the back of them to combine the theory that was in there to what happened and how it made sense, to show to people, look, you've got people at the top of their game making mistakes. So don't be worried if you're, a lowly diver that if you make a mistake, don't worry about it. And what's great is there's another book out by Stratis Cass in September called Close Calls, which is another one which has got a whole bunch of stories in there to try and break this sort of stigma that's associated with talking about mistakes. And I think part of the problem is we go into a sort of a binary bit that says it's a fatal accident or it's a normal dive. And there's a huge spectrum between them that says actually there's a whole world of learning that can happen in there, but only if the social and cultural environment allows those stories to tell. And also people to understand how they make the errors they do. Because often they will just focus on the outcome. I ran out of gas. I got entangled. Those are the two sort of critical ones from Dan. I had a rapid buoyant ascent or an uncontrolled buoyant ascent. And then you sit there and go, well, how did that happen? Well, it's just one of those things. It's like, no, there will be a bunch of things that led to that. And we need to look for those conditions and behaviors prior to the event than it would be just to focus on the outcome. And telling somebody, don't do that again without understanding what those precursors, those bits beforehand, adds very little value.
I think we're very guilty. Certainly, if we're not training, we don't debrief very often.
Yeah.
We as in my group of divers, were murdered for it. And obviously that kind of points to what you just said then about the outcome bias, isn't it? Whether we're just efficient, so everything's fine and there's nothing problem. But then when it does go wrong, it's then into the complacency element of it, isn't it? So there's a lot to be said for these debriefs.
Oh, a huge amount. And so today I was running a training session for a biopharmaceutical company. And this bit that says, what does normal look like? So when I show little snippets of videos and accident videos, people often judge them based on that 10-second snippet or a little bit of a story. And I ask the question, what does normal look like? Because accidents happen as a deviation from normal primarily, rather than a deviation from rules. Because we create safety all the time. We deviate a little bit, we break the rules, and everything's fine until we get to the point where we've stepped over the edge and then the accident happens. And it wasn't because we'd broken the rule over here. It was because we'd run out of capacity to be safe in the environment we were in. So it's and that requires us to reflect on what normal looks like. And people don't want to talk about the rules they break.
No,
because now that wouldn't be a good thing, because then people throw rocks at them for getting in the water with only half the gas needed. I'll be okay, it's only a short dive.
Yeah.
And then things snowball.
I laugh because no matter how hard I found that book to read, it was applicable to every walk of life that I've ever, all of my life. Whether it be going to work, putting a ladder up to go and do something on someone's roof, or going in the loft because you've got a wasp nest in there. Everything that I read, it was like, you could sort your life out, Andy, by just paying attention. And one thing I learned initially off Gary was the normalization of deviance. That is me to a T.
It is to everybody. It is everybody, and that's what the issue is.
Yeah,
is that and a colleague who's going to be a trainer of mine had just highlighted that there's this talk about industry training standards dropping over sort of 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and Mike turned around and said, this is a classic example of normalization of deviance at the industry level. That actually what we've done is we've eroded safety margins. And you could argue that it was too safe before, but that means that you weren't necessarily making as much money. So now you've got this trade-off between safety and money, and what is viable, and you will keep on slicing away at the safety bit until you reach a point that goes, oh, that was a bit scary, we need to back off. Now it's difficult to recover all of that because the financial situation is divers go, well, I can get a course for $200 or £200. I don't even know what an open water class costs these days. So, or I can get it for free in a club training environment.
Yeah.
Therefore, that's what I expect it to be. Well, actually, we're gonna increase the course by a couple of days, and we're going to add 25, 50% on the course price. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'll go and find another sport.
Yeah.
So you end up sort of boxing yourself into a corner without even realizing it. And if the metric of safety is the number of dead people or number of seriously injured people, fortunately, we don't have that in diving. So it's safe, which we know that it's not, because safe is the absence of risk, or absence of harm. And actually, we're underwater. We can't breathe. So
I find when you're looking back at your book, the hindsight bias quite an interesting topic, because I found quite often that I'm not as technically able, skilled, qualified, however you want to term that, or quick on my feet. I've already told you I'm crap with names, so sometimes trying to tell you a story, I might forget somebody's name or forget a specific part of it. So perhaps I'm not as easy to open up and get a point out or discuss an issue. But I find when I do, because I really want to discuss that issue, for instance, on a particular dive that went particularly wrong, and I want to put it out into a forum to see, if anybody else has had sort of similar issues and whatnot. And it's quite easy for people to just sort of look down the nose and go, "What's done that for?" Or, and they're not there, so they don't know.
Oh yeah, definitely. So having a proper brief or a planning bit of using previous experience, and getting people into the mindset to try and bring those stories to front of mind. Whereas a lot of dive briefs talk about the technical aspects of the dive, what you're going to see, what the depth is, what the maximum deco is, those sorts of bits, as opposed to what you can almost can talk about error producing conditions. So in the documentary, I talked about this model called the WITH model, where we talk about workplace, individual, task demands, and human nature. And these are the things that set people up for failure rather than success. Now you can turn it around and make it success, because what you're trying to do is stop the errors happening. But it's this bit that says, okay, it's the first dive, it's a check dive, we're going to do this, right? Do we know that the weighting is right? There's the first bit that you sit there and you go, well, of course, all right, how do we know? How confident? And so I was reading some stuff the other day about risk matrices, the sort of grids and things, and said that actually that they add very little value to risk management. What is much better is to ask, how confident are you that the controls you've got in place are going to be effective? So you turn around and go, oh yeah, buoyancy control, we know what our weighting is. Okay, how do you know? When was the last time you did a weight check? Don't know, actually. Right. How much extra time will it take us to do a weight check? Well, we don't have empty cylinders. Okay, get that. So are you diving twin 12s? There's about 5.5 kilos of gas in that. We want to end the dive 50 bar. That weighs, call it just under a kilo. 500 grams to a kilo's worth of gas. Okay, so if we get in the water, we're going to be, in effect, and we're neutrally buoyant, we're going to be 5.5 kilos heavy at the start of the dive.
Yeah.
So if you're neutral there, what you need to do is add 5.5 kilos to be neutral at the end of the dive.
Which is a flipping lot.
It is. Yeah. And so, at the start of the dive, you can get a pretty good, approximation. Now, there's all sorts of compression issues with dry suit liners and things, but it'll get you pretty close. If you're in a situation where somebody's having to be held down you're probably talking that sort of lightness, because you can control about 2 kilos of underweightedness with your lungs.
Yeah.
So if you're having to the bit where you can't control it with your lungs and somebody is having to hold you down, now that means that you're likely to have to be overweighted to be able to hold them down.
Yeah, it wasn't very good. It didn't work very well at all.
So, it's this bit that says, what are the conditions that set us up for success or failure? And are we under time pressure? Yes. Right. In that case, there's a red flag. If we're under time pressure, we are more likely to make a mistake, which perversely means that we're going to do our checks much more thoroughly. But that's going to, we're going to be definitely late. Okay, at what point does 2 minutes in a dive, getting ready for a dive, make that much difference? If it is that late, well, okay, there's a big issue, because you're probably past your slack window at that stage. So, it's understanding what those bits that set us up for failure are, and be conscious of that as a team, and be able to say, you know what, Andy, I'm feeling a bit stressed here. Can we just take a 2-minute break? And this thing called a tactical pause. You sit there and go, pause. Right. Are things how we expect them to be? And what's the evidence to prove it? Because the easiest question to answer, yes, is everything okay? Yeah. Okay, prove it. Because I think so. Right. Okay.
Yeah. You need that classic condor moment, don't you?
Oh yeah.
Just
That's a great advert. You're not old enough to remember that.
Mate, I've been in the army for long enough. I knew about that.
Yeah, definitely. So now we've got this thing called authority gradient, where you've got a novice who's not sure what's going on. They don't want to look stupid, because they're doing a dive with you as an experienced diver, and it's like, oh, okay. And you said it was a check dive as well.
Yeah.
So there's now more pressures on them. It's like, oh, okay, as in their qualifying dive for that certification. So then you're in this bit, so there is this gradient that says, I don't want to look foolish in front of the instructor. And I don't want to look foolish in front of my peers by asking the question that says, I'm not sure about my weighting, because there is an expectation that you should know what your weighting is. So just grab some lead and off you go. And it's like, I don't know. So actually the normal response is, I'll grab more than I need. And perversely, they end up in a situation where they lose buoyancy control, because they've got more air in their bladder, which expands much more quickly than when you are correctly weighted, because it's just the right amount of gas in the wing that's expanding. So that's another sort of bit that people don't get sometimes, is that sticking more lead in can do more harm than you think.
Well, let's talk about that quick. There's quite a few discussions I've been party to about having just solely integrated lead versus the weight belt that you can, so you can ditch that. So I've got a plate weight down my back plate, and then my wife's the same, but she needs another 2 kilos, so she puts them in a trim pouch on the back of a cylinder, which works really well for her. But then people wearing lead belts because they're frightened that if there's an issue, they can't ditch it. Where's your sort of stance on that?
So the bit that says, can you swim up at the start of the dive, which is in effect your worst case situation. Because if you lose your buoyancy device, now if you've got a dry suit, well that means that you don't necessarily need as much ditchable weight at all. If you're diving a wetsuit and it's all integrated into your system, and you lose the buoyancy control, your bladder fails at the start of the dive, which is the worst case situation, what are you going to do now? So it is this bit of, it's classic, it's a bit of a cop-out. It depends, because it does depend on the situation you're in. And make sure that you're not so overweighted that actually when you try to ascend with a dry suit, all that happens is you end up just pissing air out of it, because you've now got a much bigger volume to play with. So
I've never thought of that you could actually do that as part of a test for yourself, couldn't you? You could get in, you're perfectly weighted, But if it all went Pete Tong, could you actually ascend via swimming? If you've not got
the shot line, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Or even you've not got a DSMB that you could inflate at the bottom and deflate on the way back up, or anything like that. Could you actually swim? I've never even thought of trying that. Completely.
So this is one that Diver Magazine a number of years ago did a buoyancy challenge at a pool in East Anglia somewhere, and they did a piece about compressibility of wetsuits and the amount of buoyancy you lose when the wetsuits are compressed. And so one of the things that we found on our rescue class that we ran was that if you have two divers diving twin 12s with 32% in, and they might have an O2 stage, if one of those divers has an issue, you may not be able to lift them on your buoyancy device alone. So the normal bit is, you dump the gas and you control the buoyancy on your own, and you control both of you going up at the same time. If the wetsuits are compressed and they're overweighted, you may not be able to lift them. And it's like, oh, okay. So it's something that's not considered, and that's why I throw it out here, is actually, if you're going to go and do some, as people are getting back into diving, use these early weeks to get that skill set back up, to understand where the limits are, and refresh themselves in some of this, what you would almost consider basics, but because they've been learnt so long ago, they haven't been considered as something to practice. And the same goes for the more advanced diving, the bailouts, gas sharing drills, all of that stuff that has rusted over the sort of period of time that we've been off diving, and people want to jump back in. It's a human response. They want to pick up where they left off, even though they've been out the water for X months in process.
Well, I'd suggest people have been out longer than just the lockdown, because a lot of people don't dive in the winter at all, do they?
Well, there is that as well, yeah.
So certainly for my missus, we last dived in the Red Sea September, October, and then we were in Lanzarote in January for only, I think we did 5 dives, and then it was right up till yesterday she hadn't dived at all.
Yeah.
So that's whereas I dived all through the winter, I don't care me whatever. Yeah. But it's a long time.
No such thing as cold. It's just inappropriate clothing.
Correct, mate. Yeah, absolutely. which has always been a big drama for me. I cannot get the right either thermal layering. Certainly on my body, I'm okay, but my hands and my feet are just horrific. I cannot. I just won't part with about 1,200 quid to get heated gloves, boots, and jacket.
You don't need. Yeah, exactly.
No, but I've since learned, perhaps just put several pairs of gloves on, make sure they're big enough and they're not going to compress too much.
Yeah.
I've even gone from using rock boots now to a pair of wetsuit boots.
Okay.
Over the top of my socks, because rock boots have no thermal insulation, whereas a pair of wetsuit boots will keep that little bit of water slightly different temperature. And I did find it worked phenomenally well.
Okay.
So each to their own. You look a bit daft trying to get them on, but they work for me. So happy days.
Yeah, that's all right.
So dive planning. I'd like to talk about that if you can.
Yeah, sure.
Certainly. We kind of touched on it earlier about going on this checkout dive, but for recreational diving, do you think there's enough planning that goes into it? For instance, I don't so much mean the gas planning, which is always taught, whether you're using tables or whatever, but certainly like route selection, who's going to lead, the normal seeds brief that perhaps BSAT go through. But can it be either done too much, or could we do more of it?
Again, it really depends on the dive itself. So if it's something like a 10-meter reef dive, and there's an entry point, an exit point, and what the maximum runtime is, the maximum depth. Yeah. Right, fine. And then obviously I'm biased because of the way that we do a pre-dive brief with GUE Edge of what's the goal, unified team, so we know what the roles are, who's leading, who's going to put the bag up, who's going to run deco. Yeah. And then you talk about an equipment match to make sure everything's where it's supposed to be and physically check it. Don't just go, oh, okay, it's that. So, proper head to toe. Yeah. And then we'll talk about exposure in terms of dive time. and the sort of where we're going to be in terms of, and that's the next, is the depth. Then we talk about decompression. Is it going to be a min deco ascent? So we're just going to go up to half the depth and then start 3 meters a minute after that. Gases, how much have you got? What's the analysis? And what are your deco gases? And make sure what the pressures are, what you're saying. And then say what the environment is. And you can cover that in pretty much what I've just said now, 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah.
The equipment check takes a little bit longer because you are actually physically checking it. But the brief itself, it doesn't have to take very long. And you don't have to say, and the goal of the dive is, and you just have the conversation. And it's making sure that everybody is on that same song sheet before they jump in the water. And that's, a lot of, from the planning bit. See, I have a thing about, I think gas planning is not taught well enough. So normally it's, thirds. Well, thirds has got limitations.
Yeah.
And people often don't understand what it actually means anyway. But, people talk about SAC in liters per minute. And liters per minute is a useless metric for when you're underwater. What is a much better metric is bar per minute or bar per 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Because now, if you've defined what your end pressure is at depth, not be back on the surface, be back on the surface with 50 bar. Great. How much gas do I need to leave the bottom with?
What size cylinder have you got as well?
Well, yeah, exactly. So, bar per minute at depth, or bar per 5 minutes, allows you to say, right, I'm going to end the dive with, say, 40 bar in my twin 12s. I get to the bottom of the shot line and I've got 180 bar. All right, so I've got 140 bar to play with while we're on the bottom. And I've made an approximation before I've got in the water how long that 140 bar will last me. And as I'm swimming along every 5 minutes, I'll check at this and go, yeah, my consumption rate is what I expect it to be. Cool. I have got X amount of time before I end the dive. And then you sort of swim along and it's like, ooh, hang on a minute. That consumption rate's gone up a lot more than I was expecting. What's happened? Am I leaking gas somewhere? Has the current picked up so I'm working harder? Have I actually gone deeper than I was expecting because I'm following something and I haven't noticed the depth? And so this is, another sort of concept of situation awareness is you sense some information, right? The pressure gauges are saying this, depth gauge is saying this. I make sense of it now. And most importantly, what does the future look like? Am I actually going to have to cut my dive time down? And that might mean that I need to turn around sooner than I'd planned. We were going to go out for 20 minutes. We're going to come back for 20 minutes and ascend the shot line. Well, actually, I've used my gas a bit more than planned. So I'm going to turn around at 15 minutes and I'm going to get back to the shot line. And if I still have more than I need, well, I might go out 2 or 3 minutes that way and then come back to the shot line. Or I might just ascend a bit early, but people don't like wasting gas. So that's why I think planning can be spent a little bit more in terms of the gas planning side, because then it gives us a real-time understanding of how long we've got at that depth. Or if we go a bit deeper, it'll increase, and therefore we've got a little less time.
Okay, so going back to the human factors then, within the planning or briefing, where's the right point or right time to be concentrating on talking about, if you're going down to a wreck and the what ifs, how can we talk about it before it happens to try and get people in that mindset? Is it better during the planning stage, maybe at a club meeting, or, if you all meet around somebody's house for a coffee whilst if you fancy a brew? Or is it on the actual dive brief? So if for instance, such a body has a leak, what we're going to do, who's going to gas share with who, or whatever the scenario might be.
So there's 2 levels of sort of contingencies that I would consider there. One is you might have almost a project contingency. So if you're going to go and do a wreck, and it's unusual from my experience that you would go and plan something and talk around the wreck. But if you're in a club and you're going to go and do it as a club trip, well, actually, you could have the dive brief and you say, right, what we're going to do is we're enter here and we're going to swim through. And, oh, by the way, there's an issue here. Don't go through that doorway. So you'll highlight the hazards as you go along. So you can start to get some of the contingencies at that stage. But then if we're going to talk about becoming front of mind, the bits that you want people to remember straight away, okay, standard, if we have a buddy separation, because actually, you know what, the viz isn't supposed to be great. If we do have a buddy separation, then the drill is swim around for a minute, look, and then surface. If you are the sort of, which means that everybody should be back on the surface within 3 or 4 minutes of being separated.
Yeah.
And at that stage, we'll reappraise and we might say, you know, that was really early on in the dive, and we can go back down again because it's not a major issue and we've got gas reserves to deal with that. Or actually the fog is coming in. So again, it's sort of contextual. So project level, you know, for everybody, yes, you can talk about it beforehand, but most of the diving that I do, we end up on the boat, and that's the first time we meet each other.
Right.
And so at that stage, you want to cover everything you can in terms of the contingencies, the what ifs. And that's something that's, you know, the debrief and the contingencies are the bits that are often missed out of a pre-dive brief, because it's all right. We know what the buddy separation drill is. All right, really? What is it? I don't know. So if you run out of gas, what are you going to do? Well, I've got a yellow SMB. And the skipper goes, really? I didn't know that. You know, and what does a yellow SMB mean? Well, it just means that I've got a yellow SMB up. Until you brief the skipper that says red is normal and yellow is an emergency or abnormal, or it might be you send 2 bags up the same line and you get a V on the surface. So one of the key bits is, you know, any of the briefing stuff is make sure the skipper is aware of what the issues are. Now, if they're inside the club, that's a bit easier because you're going to have standard protocols. But you go on a hard boat, you know, you charter a boat, make sure you understand what the skipper's protocols are, and they know what your protocols are when it comes to dealing with contingencies.
So checklists, like I said earlier, when I did my solo diver course last year, which is always a bone of contention with a lot of people, I'll just put it out there. I like the idea of doing the course to make me a better diver. Now I've got my own camera and I tend to be on my own a little bit. We might go in as a 3. 2 of them will fire off, do whatever they're doing, whilst I'm just trying to get that particular picture, or I'm faffing around doing whatever. So the fact that I can be on my own quite competently is why I did that course, and I loved it, and I learned an awful lot. And I think I'm a big advocate for people getting on that course. I'm not selling it for anybody, but get on it if you could. But the one thing I did walk away from that course with was a very good checklist. However, it didn't stop me from getting in the water without a dive computer on once. I was in, fins on, just about put my mask on, and fins were off, and I walked back to my van, got my computers on, obviously, and carried on with the dive. Because I hadn't done what I've since learned is the Japanese finger point technique.
Yep.
Which I think is a cracking video.
It is. It's great.
So what's your thoughts on a diving checklist?
So the first question I say is, what do you mean by a checklist?
Okay.
And it's a genuine question, because checklist is a really broad term. And, you know, where the biggest emphasis on checklists at the moment in diving is rebreather diving.
Right.
And people go, right, you've got to use a checklist. And you go, okay, so what do you mean by a checklist? Do you mean a build checklist? Do you mean an on-site checklist to make sure that the kit is ready to go? And then a pre-jump within 5 minutes of getting off the back of the boat or off the quayside or whatever into the water checklist. So that's why I asked the question, because each one of those checklists has a very different purpose. And if you try to combine them all together, you end up with this unwieldy checklist that people will go, oh, I'm not going to use it. So the first bit is make sure that they are operationally relevant. So, you know, GUE Edge is a verbal checklist that, and it's done in a challenge and response manner. So there are different ways of executing checklists as well. If you're going to dive in a team, you want a checklist written in a way that says, okay, Andy, goal of the dive is this, unified this, equipment check, right, hood, mask, glove, you know, and you basically do head to toe.
Yes.
And we cross-check each other as we do it. That's different to a solo checklist, which should be a read and do checklist. So the other one was a challenge and response, and this is a read and do. So read the line item, do the item, or check. So that's Shisha Kanko, the Japanese train driver thing.
Yeah.
Do it one line item at a time, and use a placeholder like a thumb or a China graph or something that keeps your place.
Well, the one thing I learned from that particular dive where I got in, I normally dive 2 computers, one like a bottom timer and then one a proper computer, is my checklist, although it's bound together with a little ring binder, I didn't have any pencil to tick anything off. So guess what I've got now? I've got myself a little China graph.
Yeah. So go through that, check it off, because the way that our brains work is if we get distracted, what happens is our brains are constantly looking to the future in timelines. Yeah. So you read a checklist and you go, I got distracted. Oh, okay, hang on. And we automatically think we're further down the list than we actually are because you have done that. And it's like, well, okay, if you break a check, remake it, go back a few steps, or potentially redo the whole checklist, right. And make sure that's the case. So the build checklist needs to be simple enough that prompts training memory. An on-site checklist is make sure that it is operating safely and is configured how it should be, and all of the equipment is there. And then your final dive check is done as a brief bit that says, what's going to keep me alive in the water by following these? What are literally the killer items? You know, in terms of open circuit, realistically, it's about making sure that your gas is turned on, you've got a buoyancy device, the buoyancy sources work. And I'll do a GUE edge with the team when we're ready and we're sort of 5 minutes to go. But as soon as I step off the bench, I've got a habit that goes dry suit inflate, wing inflate, and I've got a breathable gas. Yeah. Because anything else, as long as I've not got a hypoxic mix, but in that case, I'm going to be using a travel gas anyway. Yeah. As soon as I step off the back of the boat, I've got the ability to resolve my issues with the team. And if that means I get back on the boat, well, tough shit. I'll thumb the dive and off we go. So checklists need to be operationally relevant. If you're in a team environment, they need to be consistent to the team members. Because if you're doing a check and it's not quite the same as me, is it because you've forgotten a line item in the check, or is it because you've been taught to do something differently? And if we've got this authority gradient, and I can't ask you, Andy, that doesn't look right. Have you forgotten something? If I'm afraid to do that, you're not going to get your missing piece picked up. Mm-hmm. And role modeling is massively important. The amount of instructors who don't do buddy checks when they're training, the students do the buddy check. Yeah. Okay. You're also part of that team, which is something that instructors often forget as well. You have 2 teams running, a student team and an instructor student team, the learning team and the student operation team.
I get that.
So there's lots of stuff in this.
I'll put my hand up. I've been guilty of that as an instructor. Go on, I'll just watch you, right, and let's get in. And fortunately, not fell foul of it yet. But I'll not pay lip service.
Make a note now.
I'll not pay lip service to this conversation. Right, I did, as you've seen, I have asked online for some questions, and my phone has been going nuts.
Has it?
On Cape and Ray's page, there's loads of likes for that picture of your book. There was a guy there yesterday, parked at the side of us. So he's asked, I have no idea what he means by this question. So maybe you can help me. Does he do the Freddie Mercury or David Bowie? Because love's such an old-fashioned word. And I'm like, listen, I'm only 40. I don't get your right. It's that. We were like, I had no idea what he was on about. So we were having dinner before, and Ali, my wife, she's looking, going, "What do you mean by that?" Clearly, that's your book, innit? So I didn't.
Yes, under pressure. There we go.
Forgive me if I'm wrong here, but do you still do an awful lot of public speaking, or is it just on the instructor circuit as such?
No, so tomorrow night I'm on Dive Soft's Dive Talks, so that's going out. Friday night I'm working with the World Extreme Medicine Conference. So I'm doing a webinar, and then I've got some stuff with Chantel's Dive Minute next week, plus raids talks as well. So at the moment we're locked down. I'm doing sort of 1 or 2 talks a week, which is fine, and it's just a big education piece. And I'm doing work elsewhere with sort of military teams now as well, which is great. And I'm hoping that, you know, the documentary that was released in May, if only, as a way of generating more interest about trying to change attitudes towards accidents. That whole bit about having a just culture so that we can learn from things that have gone wrong because people are able to tell those context-rich stories, but also psychological safety that we need to create so that people can put their hand up and say, this isn't quite right. Can we have a quick check or a chat about this? And
without
make sure
that
that
sort
we're
of
doing
fear
the right
of condemnation.
Yeah. So, and it's making sure that you know, the recognition that psychological safety is proactive. You're trying to prevent an accident from happening by creating the right conditions. And a just culture is reactive because the accident has happened or the incident's happened, and therefore we can talk about it. So they both work together, but they are subtly different.
I was going to say, I've seen in industry, which is kind of, it must work against what you've just been talking about, this just culture. You have these boards up. It's almost like a square for every day of the year. And it's a pink dot if there's been no accident, a black one if it's been a near miss. And obviously, I'm saying obviously.
I'm glad you've spotted that. That is a huge thing. So I do some work for another organization, another consultancy called Paradigm Human Performance. And we work in construction, heavy industry, power generation, all sorts of stuff. And the number of zero incident stuff that we're talking about, zero harm, it has been 370 days since our last incident. And it's like, holy shit. It's, you know, I've just made a mistake. I've just hurt myself. And the chances of me going to the health and safety people going, and if there is a financial bonus associated with that as well, boy, you know, you are not. And so, yes, we should reward excellence, but putting, you know, financial rewards or the sort of peer pressure that says it's 300 and whatever it is, that's not a learning organization. And that's something that certainly Teach outside of the diving area is trying to change attitudes to failures.
I almost want to ask that
in general.
I almost want to go into that company that I was at and go, I can't believe that nobody's had a plaster off you, or, you know, because there must be something. But
well, I mean, I'm doing some work in the States, and the guy's saying, you know, they brought somebody in with a broken leg because they could do desk work, and it wasn't a lost time injury. And you're like, yeah, right, okay. So, you know, what you reward and or punish is what people will then influence people's behaviors. And, you know, drawing the parallels to the diving industry, rewarding people for the number of certificates that they've issued, which is great because it gives them some kudos. But if you're not going to check the quality that's associated with those high numbers, then actually all we do is we introduce a problem, a long growing problem, into the industry. And it is very difficult to, the longer you leave a problem, the harder it is to try and fix it or trace where the problem is, because it's way back in time. So, you know, having a proper, effective quality control system is essential to get that feedback. Same as debriefs.
So like our BSAC run the safety conference, and they go through all the incident reports throughout the year. That will highlight trends and other things, won't it? That I suppose is quite good. I mean, I can't compare to. I've done TDI, I've done RAID, I've done SDI, but not a lot. You know, I've just done a course and then carry on because I'm in a BSAC club or because I was through joint services. So I can't compare, and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't happen. I don't know, but that can only be a good thing that they are investigating that way and discussing it.
Well, they are, and the downside is that the investigation is in the main limited to what is submitted by the report writer themselves, and they're often focused on outcomes rather than what, you know, a lot of what I do is obviously human factors basis. is how did it make sense for people to do what they did? And if you've got an incident that might be classified, and they are, I think they're changing it, but it's previously been a flat PDF that you can't pull the data out. You can, but it's really difficult to do it. The classification, the most severe event is how they're classified. So you could have a decompression sickness event, which was triggered by a rapid ascent, which was triggered by an out of gas, which was triggered by something else. And what we need to understand is, what was the story that led to the out of gas situation?
Yeah.
I mean, Dan's work from early 2000s, of the 900 plus fatalities they had that they got in their records, and they could attribute a trigger. And so one of those was running out of gas, others were entanglement or health issues. 41% of the fatalities that they could attribute a trigger to were down to out of gas. And it's like, okay, great. You know what, Andy, when you go diving, don't run out of gas.
No problem.
And so, yeah, I won't do that. So, and telling people to pay more attention doesn't help. We've got to understand why they're not paying attention, what the distractors are. So when I spoke to Petar Denoble, who was the head of research at Dan at the time, and I said, look, it's great that you've captured the triggers, because we can then start focusing on developing more skills in gas awareness and gas planning. But we need to go further back. We need to understand why they ran out of gas. And he said, the data is just not there. And normally, this is why I'm also thinking about looking for non-fatal incidents, because we can talk, because you can talk to the decision maker. The majority of fatal accidents, the decision maker is dead. So you can't ask them how it made sense. So all of these bits link together in terms of just culture, instant reporting, analysis, human factors. They're all a system that says, how do we learn, as opposed to, he ran out of gas, he didn't ditch his weight belt on the surface. Great. That doesn't help me learn at all, because make sure you ditch your weight belt.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't, because it's on my back plate screwed in with a couple of wing nuts. I'm screwed. Yeah.
So no, it's a huge topic. The only thing that I would say was, to try and I don't know if you were saying about stuff to, what I'd like to talk about. Have you watched If Only as the documentary?
Yeah, I have.
The story behind that documentary, in May 2018, a student on a technical diver rebreather training class died because they got off the back of the boat with their oxygen cylinder turned off, and they went hypoxic, and they drowned. And that would be the short answer, and that would be normally the thing that you would say. And it's like, well, make sure that you turn the oxygen cylinder on. Yeah. And the documentary was based around interviews with a widow, Ashley Buggy, who's an incredibly brave woman, to talk about the story leading up to that. So that's, something that I'm trying to get out there and promote more, is the fact that, this isn't just a rebreather learning story. This is a dive learning story. And actually, I've had people who have come to me from healthcare and said, can I play this in the theaters to the team we have? And it's like, yeah, crack on. And there is a workbook that I've put together, which you should, if you're on my mailing list, you should have got a copy. If not, I'll send it to you afterwards. Cheers. Which allows people to run their own workshops. So the idea being that they'll explain, I've given them a little bit of a narrative to read out, and then say, okay, here's a whiteboard, write down all the reasons why you think that accident happened. And then play the first sort of 18, 20 minutes of the video, which is where I then start doing some analysis. So stop the video then and say, right, now you've seen this, what do you think the reasons are for the accident occurring? And get them to write them up on a board in a different color. And then play the analysis piece afterwards. And then get them to say, okay, now you've done that, what do you think? And then the guide also helps the facilitator look at all of the factors that went into this. And in the 18 minutes of narrative, I pulled out about 50 plus contributory factors that go to that look at the individual, the supervisory bits, because the instructor failed in their duties, but understanding why that happened. and what happened at the sort of the organizational dive center training, all sorts of stuff that sits above. So
wow. That'd be great for a club evening, you know, when we get together. Not necessarily build up to a particular dive, but just to set people's brains in motion and think that outside the box is the best way, isn't it? To sort of put it under one.
And that's why I wrote it. And shortly afterwards, I had a club contact me and said, we're having our sort of monthly club bit. We're going to watch If Only. Do you mind coming on and doing like a 10-minute intro to the film? It's like, yeah, fine, not a problem at all. So did the intro, let them to watch it. And then the following week, they went through the facilitator's guide and talk about what they'd seen the previous week. And it certainly got people thinking about things. And that was really the whole goal of the documentary, is to get people to look at these things in a different way, rather than say, should have turned his oxygen on. Yes, we know that, because unfortunately he died. But that's not going to help us stop these things happening again in the future.
So what's next? Have you got any additions to make to the book? Or have you got any plans should this COVID ever go away?
So I'd like to do another book, a sort of a practical guide, one that is more at the sort of, when you said, oh my God, this is the hardest book I've read, it's almost the opposite scale of almost the dummy's guide to human factors in diving. A sort of real base level of bits that gives people lots of practical advice. Now, there are lots of practical things in the book, but it takes a lot of effort to read that. So putting something like a dummy's guide to human factors in diving together. In 2.5 weeks' time, I launch so actually it'll be whenever this goes out, the 11th and 12th of July is when the next format of courses that the Human Diver is putting together. So those are blended learning programs. So we've got a bit of online learning to get the knowledge developed. And then we've got a 2-day, 2 times 5-hour workshop that basically goes through in practical exercises how to apply the knowledge that they've developed, looking at case studies in an interactive way. And those are going to start 11th, 12th of July. That's going to be the beta. We're then going to review what we do. And then probably, I would think, start of August, end of July, start of August, we'll start running more of these classes. And because I've now got 5 instructors, I've got one in Vancouver, one in Montreal, one in Dubai, one in Dahab, and one in one in the Netherlands. And I've got 5 more growing in September through to February. Hopefully we'll be able to create more change as well.
I really appreciate you giving me a couple of hours of your time this evening when it's beautiful and you could be sat out on the gin and tonics in the garden.
Oh, I know. I'm just looking out there now. It's baking hot down here. So
I should have got up 20 minutes ago and opened that window because I'm sweating cobs in here. So I'll leave you to go and crack on in your garden.
Thanks very much for that.
Thanks for your time, Gareth.
Thanks very much, Andy. Bye-bye. Cheers. Take care. Bye.
So that brings to an end episode 14 with Gareth Lock. Links to all the things we discussed are in the podcast notes. My guest on episode 15 is Claire Dutton, a PADI course director, the operator of Vivian Dive Centre in North Wales, and also a firefighter. You've been listening to Are You a Scuba Diver? Fancy a Brew with me, Andy the Northern Diver. You can find more scuba related content on my YouTube channel. The link is in the podcast notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and leaving us a 5-star review. If there's someone or something you'd like us to discuss, let us know via our Facebook page. Thanks for listening and see you on the next one.